Feast of Tabernacles. This podcast is a Bible study. It requires no knowledge of Accordance Bible software, or Hebrew, or Greek. The Feast of Tabernacles was the largest and most joyous of ancient Israel's 3 annual pilgrimage feasts. It occurs at the autumnal equinox and celebrates the end of Israel's harvest season. Its importance grew over time as it added national, spiritual, and even eschatological themes. Regular feasts and festivals are established for all sorts of reasons. They can be seasonal, celebrating the annual solar cycle or monthly lunar cycle; agricultural, marking the seasons of plowing, planting, and harvest; religious, and these celebrations certainly vary with religion, but in the case of Israel, they absolutely included the Sabbath. Festivals can also be national, celebrating military victories or changes in leadership or government; historical, in which we commemorate natural disasters or other unusual events; even life cycle, where the passage from birth to adulthood, marriage, fertility, childbirth, and death are all marked by various rituals. The greatest feasts combine more than one of these and tend to accumulate others as time goes on. The Feast of Tabernacles was just such a great feast. First, the Feast of Tabernacles was a seasonal feast, as it occurs on or about the autumnal equinox. The time when the earth's tilt ensures that there is exactly an equal amount of day and night. Ancient people, lacking modern artificial illumination, were keenly aware of both the solar and lunar cycles and the way they affected their daily lives. While this year's Jewish calendar places Yom Kippur on exactly this date, with the Feast of Tabernacles following, in other years it works out differently. There's even some evidence that the feast in ancient Israel was timed so that the autumnal equinox regularly occurred during it rather than before it. In fact, the sun influenced the orientation of the Jerusalem temple, and one would presume that of the tabernacle as well. The Mishnah describes several Second Temple practices that do not appear in the Mosaic prescriptions. First, several huge menorah were assembled in the temple courtyards during tabernacles. Once lit, they would burn all night, while people danced by torchlight to the sounds of flutes, harps, cymbals, and lyres. The dancing ended at dawn, when the rising sun would cast its rays through the eastern gate, across the brazen altar, and into the interior of the structure. 2 priests with shofars stood at the upper gate. They then marched to the eastern gate, stopping and sounding their shofars 7 times. When they reached the gate, they turned their backs on the rising sun and said, "Our fathers who were in this place turned with their backs toward the temple of the Lord and their faces toward the east, and they worshiped the sun toward the east." Ezekiel 8:16. "But as for us, our eyes are to the Lord." The Feast of Tabernacles' daily dawn procession became one of the most popular rituals of the feast during the Second Temple period. Here's a photo of a temple model that includes the 2 great candlesticks. Tabernacles is also, and perhaps even primarily, an agricultural feast. The Gezer calendar on the left is dated to the 10th century BCE and is one of the oldest Hebrew inscriptions we have. It lists the agricultural activities of each month. The chart on the right includes a translation of this inscription and correlates it to the other calendars in use at the time. Notice that the Feast of Tabernacles, also called Booths and Ingathering, occurs after the olive, grape, and fig harvest, but before the plowing for the new season. It thus marked the end of the last harvest of the agricultural year. The agricultural aspect of Tabernacles is stressed in 2 of the oldest descriptions we have of it. Both Exodus 23 and 24 call it the Feast of Ingathering, while Leviticus 23 specifies it occurs after they have gathered in the produce of the land. It further commands that they gather leafy boughs, using some of them to construct booths or huts in which they would live for the week-long feast. Some scholars believe these booths were based on huts in which the harvesters would live during the harvest season. That way they could guard their orchards, vines, and fields from thieves. Here, they've been repurposed to serve as temporary shelters for the festival, a real necessity for the crowds that would eventually swell the population of Jerusalem to several times its normal size. There would not have been enough permanent housing there to contain them. Notice that verse 43 adds a historical reference with national and religious meanings. Henceforth, the booths would remind them of their exodus from Egypt and the land of milk and honey God would provide them at the end. This feast is also the likely occasion when Israelites obeyed Deuteronomy 14. It commanded them to set aside a tithe of the entire season's produce, bring it to the temple, and feast and drink before the Lord. According to verse 26, that tithe included wine or other fermented drink, which led to some of the excesses of the feast condemned by any number of Old Testament prophets. Because of its popularity, the Feast of Tabernacles also became the event at which many historical events were celebrated, most of them with religious and nationalistic overtones. Chief among these was the dedication of Solomon's temple. And it's worth noting that the Feast of Tabernacles was also the time when Israel prayed for Gentiles to come to the Lord, sacrificing 70 bulls for them over 7 days. The unusual sacrifices began with 13 bulls, offering one less each of the 7 days of the feast. The 8th day, Simchat Torah, a single bull was offered for the nation of Israel. After the return from exile, when the second temple was built, the Feast of Tabernacles also featured prominently at its rededication. The people followed the Mosaic Law, living in booths and waving leafy branches in celebration during the 7 days of the feast. Ezra also read the law at the feast, just as Moses had commanded in Deuteronomy. Again, while this is another historic celebration of the feast, notice the way that Israel's religion and national hopes figure into that celebration. One more festival practice not found in the books of Moses is the water libation. Each day the priests filled a golden pitcher from the pool of Siloam. With great fanfare they then carried it to the altar, where they poured out libations of water and wine. During the pouring, the priest would pray for the coming rains and the resurrection of the dead. Some Old Testament scholars believe that this is the occasion to which Isaiah 12:3 refers. And there are many New Testament scholars who believe this event was the point at which Jesus of Nazareth cried out, "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink," as recorded in John 7:37. There's no doubt that the kings of Israel took advantage of the opportunities afforded by the crowds at Tabernacles. It would have been an opportune time to dispense judgment upon the guilty and rewards upon the faithful. Many Old Testament scholars believe that tabernacles included royal processions, reenactments of the king's enthronement. The Hebrew Bible's enthronement psalms support that, as does the fact that the feast became so identified with the fortunes of the house of David. Since they believed the Davidic line had been established by God, the fact that a descendant of his still reigned indicated God's continuing favor. When the throne sat empty, popular hopes turned toward a Davidic Messiah and the renewed blessings of God. Again, all of this is just another way in which national and religious themes mingled during the feast. Finally, the Feast of Tabernacles also developed an eschatological component. We've already alluded to the hope of a Davidic Messiah in the post-exilic period. Gerhard von Rad argued that the Feast of Tabernacles was the feast of the Lord, the day of the Lord, and the foundation of Israel's eschatology. Whether or not he was right, there's no question that it figured prominently in Israel's hope for the future. Zechariah 14, for instance, describes how, after the Lord wages war on the nations that oppose Israel, the survivors of those nations will be required to celebrate tabernacles every year. Those that don't will be struck with plague and drought. I trust you've enjoyed this overview of the Feast of Tabernacles and the many different illustrations available in our software resources. We here at Accordance wish you a blessed Tabernacles feast, or whatever festival of harvest you may celebrate with your loved ones. This has been Dr. J for Accordance Bible Software. Thank you for watching this episode of Lighting the Lamp.